Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Introduction to SAS class. The notes that we're going to be using for today's class are available on our website, and that website is www.ats.ucla.edu/stat. From here, please click on SAS, Classes and Seminars, and then Introduction to SAS. Here we see the various units that we are going to be covering in today's class. We have these, and we will go through each one of these and see how to accomplish these various tasks. I'm going to scroll down here a little bit, and you can see here that you can download the data files that we'll be using for today's class by clicking on this link here called sasdata.zip. And this will download onto your computer a WinZip file that you can unzip. You can store these data files anywhere that you like. The class notes assume that you saved it on your C drive in a directory called SAS. However, you can save it wherever you want to and just change the path names accordingly. I, for one, did not save my data files here, and so if you watch what I'm doing, you'll see that I'm pointing to another directory. Alrighty, let's get over here and get into the class. So I'm going to click here on Entering Data. And at the top here, we can see a list of the commands that we're going to learn about in this unit. And the point of this unit is to help you bring data files into SAS. As you might imagine, you're not always given a data file that is already in SAS data format and just ready to be read in. Instead, you're likely to be given something like an Excel file or some sort of ASCII text file, something like that. And the first thing you need to know how to do is just to get it into SAS. So that's what we're going to cover right now. So we have a list of the commands that we're going to use, and the first thing that I guess needs to be mentioned here is that SAS, unlike most other statistical analysis programs, breaks things up into what they call data steps and proc steps. And so in a data step, you do the kinds of manipulations to the data that you might want to do, create new variables, modify variables, those kinds of things. And then the proc steps, that's where you do the actual procedure on the data, and proc is short for procedure. So the procedures we'll be covering in this unit include something called contents, which will show you information about the contents of your data file, how many observations, how many variables, what format the variables are in, and those kinds of things, and a procedure called print. And what this does is prints to the screen or to the output window the variables that you specify, and if you don't specify any variables, then it prints to the screen all of the variables in the current data set. Be aware that proc print does not send anything to a printer. If you're trying to get a printout of your data or a printout of something else, you need to use another method of getting that out, usually through a point-and-click interface. Okay, so don't go running to the printer looking for your data or something if you use proc print. Alrighty, let's get moving on here, and the first type of file that we're going to try to import today is an Excel file. And this particular Excel file has the variable names on the first line of the file. And so we now know that, and that's important to us. Let's click down here, and I've got SAS running, so this is what SAS actually looks like. And you can see this window down here. I have mine arranged at the bottom, but yours might be somewhere else, and you can just move these windows around. It's no big deal. They just kind of move wherever you want them to be. This is your editor window, sometimes known as the enhanced editor window, and you type into here your SAS programs that you want to submit. Up here we see the log window. In this window you will see the echo of the commands that you submit, and any information regarding those commands. So SAS will give you notes or warnings or error messages up here in this log window. Over here we see the Explorer window, and we'll get to what this does in just a moment, but basically it allows you to see the data sets that you've created in a format with which you might be a little more familiar. It looks more like an Excel kind of format where you've got your data in rows and columns and you can actually see the data set in that format. And finally, perhaps the most important window is this one that's minimized down here, and that's the output window. And so when you run a procedure that produces output or something like that, you will find that in that window there. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to the way SAS is set up. Let's just try and get this data file in so we've really got something to look at. Okay, I'm going to come up here to File, click here. I'm going to scroll down here to Import Data, click on that, and this opens up the Import Wizard. Now, it defaults here to an Excel format, which is exactly what we want to look for, so we don't need to change anything here, and I'll click here on Next. Okay, SAS now needs to know where our file is located, so I'll click up here on Browse, and you need to do some browsing around on your computer to find where this file is. That's where mine is located. I'm going to click on Open, and let's see here, ready to click on Next. Here for Member, what SAS really wants is a name of the data file. So I'm going to type in HS0, and I'll get to what this work thing here is in a minute. Just go ahead and leave it alone. Click on Next. Alright, do we want to see the proc import statements? No, I don't. Instead, I'm just going to click down here and finish. And as you can see, not a whole lot seemed to have happened. In fact, it's not even really clear if the data set came in unless you look up here in the log window and see this note here. And it says that HS0 was successfully created. And you'll notice that this work dot thing is right here, and this is the same as that library that said work that we just saw. So I don't know about you, but I would really like to see the data set to see if it really did come in. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to double click on this libraries icon here. I'm going to come down to my library called work, double click on that, and now we see HS0, and I'm going to double click on this. And there we go. And like I said, this is kind of an Excel kind of setup where you've got your data out in rows and columns, and you can see the data just as it is. And we're going to be working with this data set quite a lot, and so you will see variations on this data set in the other examples that we use to bring in from other formats. So if you see this data set seem to reappear over and over again, well, that's what we intended. So that's that. Okay. There are other kinds of files that we can bring in through the import wizard. Basically, you do the same thing, just make a few different selections, and you can bring in a wide variety of types of data. Another way to do this, however, is to use a data step. Okay, and so we'll need to do a little bit of programming, but that's okay. And so let us close out of this. We're back here to our editor, and now what I'd like to do is go back to our class notes. I'm going to click on this to bring my notes back up. I'm going to scroll down some, and what we have here is an example of a comma delimited format file, usually given as a .csv for comma separated values format. And you can do this again either through the import wizard, but we're going to show you how to do it with the data step as well. And one thing we want to point out here is this line here that we've got in bold. And the reason is you see the double comma here with nothing in between it. And that is indicating that we have a missing data value right there. Okay? So, now that we have all of this in mind, let's scroll down a little bit more and see the program that we're going to use to bring this in. Here, this is a SAS keyword data. We're calling the data set temp. This is just the name that we have given to it. You could call it anything you want. We have selected temp. Here we have the in-file statement. Here is the path directory telling SAS where to find this file. We have a delimiter option. This tells SAS what delimiter to be expecting. And this DSD out here is required, and it tells SAS how to treat the delimiters, and it allows the two consecutive delimiters to indicate a missing data value, and that's why we were pointing that out up above. So that's what this option does here. We need to use this input statement to tell SAS the names of all of our variables. Otherwise, SAS wouldn't know what to call the variables, so we tell it that. And this $sign here indicates to SAS that we have a character or a string variable, and that is the variable that immediately precedes the $sign. So program type here, or PRG type, is the string variable. And if I scroll up just a little bit here, you can see that sure enough, these are words here, and so that's why it's a string variable. And then we will use proc print to print to our output window the contents of our data file. So that's what we are going to try to do. Now, some of us are better typists than others, and I am one of the worst typists, so I'm going to highlight this here, and I'm going to copy and paste it into my editor window like that. You can type it in yourself if you like, or you can do my little trick here. You need to change the in-file path name if necessary, if you didn't save it over on CSAS. And so that's what we've got here. Now, you have several options for how to submit this data step here. You can highlight everything here and click on the running person up here, and you can see that it tells you that this is the submit button. If you want to submit everything that is in the editor window, which in this case we do, you don't need to highlight anything. Instead, you can just come up here and click on your little running person. Another option you have is to press the F3 key on your keyboard. If you do not want to keep mousing around all the time and running up to hit your little running person, well, you can press the F3 key on your keyboard, and that's another way of submitting the data step, or any of the procs, anything. So I'm going to highlight everything here, and I'm going to come up here and click on my running person, and we see that all sorts of stuff went blowing past us. Let's scroll up here and see what happened. Alrighty, this is the note that we had seen previously. Here we see SAS echoing the commands that we had given, so those are exactly this right here. It says that found everything okay. It found 200 records in this file. That was good. The dataset work.temp has 200 observations and 11 variables. Well, that's very good. That's exactly what we were hoping for. And then it says that it read 10 observations from work.temp. And the reason it only read 10 observations and not all 200 is this obs equal 10 option that we had out here on this proc print. Now, I didn't go over this proc print too carefully, so let's stop and have a little look at it. We'll look at it down here in our editor window. The command is proc print, and as you can see, the command words are in the dark blue bold kind of print here. Data here is a SAS keyword, and then we have equals temp. And the reason we have this is that SAS will allow you to have multiple data files open at one time. And so you can very easily switch back and forth by simply naming the different data files in each of the procedures or the data steps that you run. Now this can get you into some trouble if you happen to run your procedure or whatever on the wrong data file, or one of my favorite mistakes is to type in data equals whatever and accidentally type in the wrong data file name. And that's always a good source for confusion for a couple of moments. This obs equals 10 says just read in up to observation 10. And so we come down here and we click on our output window. Sure enough, there we see it. So we see that we have 10 observations. We have gender, which is a 0, 1 variable. A variable called ID gives our D numbers. Here we have a variable called race, SES. This here is school type. Here's our program type that we saw before. And then the rest of the variables just as we had specified. Okay, so we have successfully brought in a .csv file. Let's see here. The next kind of file is called a fixed format file. And to see what this looks like, let's return down here to our class notes. So I'll click down here, and I'm going to scroll down some. Here we go. And this is an example of a fixed format file. And this type of file always requires the use of a code book. And we have an example of a code book right down here. And what this does is it tells you the name of the variable and then the columns in which those data are located. So in this first example, ID is located in columns 1 and 2, and a variable called A1 is located in columns 3 and 4. T1 is located in columns 5 and 6, and so on. And so you need to provide SAS both of these pieces of information to read this kind of data file. So I'm going to scroll over here. My mouse behaves. There it goes. Okay. And so, whoops, mouse still not behaving right. Come on, mouse. Okay, so here's our keyword data. We're going to call this file fixed. You can call it whatever you want, but we just named it fixed. We use the infile command, and we give the path name where the file is located. On our input statement, we give the variable name and then the columns in which the data are located. Variable name columns, etc. And then we're going to use proc print again to read these data in the output window. Again, I'm going to copy and paste it from the web page, but you can type this into SAS. I am going to highlight this, and I'm going to press the delete key on my keyboard to get rid of this. It's just a way of clearing things out. You don't need to do that. You can just paste this in or type it in beneath that if you want to do it that way. It doesn't make much difference. Again, I need to change my path. Oops, let's see here. And so you modify your path to wherever your data file is located. I like to look things over real quick to make sure that everything is as I want it to be or expect it to be. And then I'm going to come up here and click on my running person. And we're immediately brought to our output window. But before we get to that, let's come down here. We'll click on the log so that we can see our log file. And with SAS, it's often a very good idea to look at the log file before you look at the output, because SAS will sometimes give you output even though there were warning messages or error messages in the log file, and if you skip looking at that log file, well, then you're not going to see those warnings or those errors, and you're going to assume everything was okay when in fact it was not. So it's a good idea to get into the habit of looking at that log file first. So it says here that it found my data file, it read in 10 records from it. This data file, work.fixed, had 10 observations, 7 variables, and then it used proc print. Okay, everything looks all right. Let's come back here to the output. Here are our 10 observations, and here are our variables. Okay, so that was not too painful. Let's see here, what's next? We may want to just input data directly into SAS. That often happens. People have their experiment or their survey, and they have the forms that their subjects completed, and what you want to do is just type it into SAS yourself. Okay, when you want to do that, what do? Come down here and you click on your editor, and again, I'm going to highlight all this and press my delete key on my keyboard to clear it out, but you don't need to do that. I just do that so that it doesn't get confusing what I'm doing. And then let's come back down here to our notes, bring up our web page again, and let's say that this is our little data set that we want to bring in. So we're going to call this HSB10. We get the name right here. We're going to input these variables, and these are the actual data themselves. So if this is what we want to do, how do you type all that in? Well, the truth of the matter is I have it sitting out here in Notepad, and I'm going to do my copy and paste routine so that I don't have to type this in, because that would take a while, and heck, I'm just not a good typist, and I'd probably make a lot of mistakes. So here it is in the data editor, and I'm going to expand my data editor a little bit so that you can see more of this in one go of it. Okay, keyword data. Here's the name of the data file, so we're going to call it HSB10. Here's our input statement, and you can see that we've listed out the names of all of our variables. We use the $sign immediately after this variable SCH type, which is short for school type. And here you can see that the variable is in fact a string variable, which we called pub, short for public. When we finish listing all of that, we come in here, we have data lines, a SAS keyword that tells you that the data are about to begin. You may also see this as cards. The old keyword was cards, the new keyword is data lines. They do the same thing. There's all that. It ends in a semicolon. The semicolon must be on a line by itself. Now, I have heard that in the most recent versions of SAS, this isn't a requirement, but that's just kind of the programming practice that's been around with SAS for a long time, so I'd recommend just leaving that semicolon down there by himself. Here is the run. This tells SAS that the step is ended, and then we have our proc print, just as before, and again followed by a run. So you can think of run as a step boundary. So it ends the data step, it ends the proc step, and that's what it is. The other thing that I kind of been blowing over, and I should mention, is the use of these semicolons here at the end of things. And what this is telling SAS that this is the end of this statement, move on to the next statement. So here this tells SAS this is the end of this statement. Here we have a carriage return without a semicolon, and SAS doesn't even see this carriage return. It just keeps reading and reading happily until it finds a semicolon. And so one of the very common errors of SAS programmers, especially beginning SAS programmers, is to leave off that semicolon. So you might want to check around and make sure that you've got all the semicolons where you mean them to be. Okay, we have all of this in here, and let's click up here on our running person to see what happens. And again, we're immediately brought to our output window, and we can see that the data look like they've been brought in fine, but we're not really sure. We're going to click on log, and we're going to come back up here scrolling up, here we go. So we see that the data were brought in. Here's SAS acknowledging this, and it says that we had 10 observations and 11 variables, which is what we had, and then here's the proc print saying that it read in 10 observations and everything looks fine. So now we can look at this and assume that everything is fine. Alright, now I guess the next issue to discuss in SAS is all of that stuff when we were over in the Explorer window before. Let's click down here. If you see Explorer down here, and it says Contents of Work. Well, SAS has things broken up into libraries, and the Work library is a default library that is set up by SAS every time you start a SAS session. And this is where SAS keeps what they call a temporary data set. And a temporary data set is one that exists only for the duration of that SAS session, and when you close out of SAS, the data set ceases to exist. Now, the program used to create the data set may still exist if you saved your program, but the data file itself doesn't exist. And you may want this or you may not want this, but there is a way to make the data sets permanent. And so let us show you how to do that. Okay. Again, I'm going to come back down here to my class notes. I'll click here. And again, I need to scroll down some. And here we have the code for making the data set permanent. And let's look at this to see what's really happening. We have the keyword data. We're familiar with this. But now, instead of just a name with no quotes, what we have is a path name enclosed in quotes. And when you name the data set with a path name, SAS will save it to wherever you have specified. So that's how you make a permanent data file in SAS. It's one of at least 2 different ways of doing it. This is the quote new way. This method works in SAS version 8. It does not work in SAS version 6 or 6.12 or some of the older versions of SAS. But in SAS version 8, this is how you can do it. This set statement here says base this new data file on this data file here that we already have. Okay, so that's what that is, and then of course we have run. So that is what you would submit, and so I'm going to do my copy and paste trick again because, well, my typing still hasn't improved any. And I'm just going to press the enter key here and paste it down here, and I'm going to change my directory. Let's see here, and so I've got that. Now I'm going to highlight this because I only want to run this part of it. I don't want to run this stuff up here. I'm going to come up here and click on my running person. Doesn't look like a whole lot happened, does it? Let me make this a little bit smaller again, and I'm going to click here on log, and we can see here that everything was successful. So the 10 observations were read from here, and we see that this data file was created with the 10 observations and the 7 variables. Now, the other thing we can do is use this in our proc print. So, we'll come down here and we will say, like I said, I can't type, proc print data equals, well now I'm going to copy and paste this right down here and then put in my run, and now SAS will do the proc print off of this permanent data file. So I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to come up here and click on my running person, and there's the proc print just as we saw it before. Again, I'm going to click here to see my log, and it says right here that SAS read it from my D drive. So it's saying that it read it off of that permanent data file that's permanently saved down onto my D drive. Okay, That seems to be quite a bit. Let's see here. The last thing in the note says to delete all of these other data files out of our directory since we don't need them. I don't know if you really need to do this, but let me just show you how to do it. Click down here on this Explorer tab, and so here is temp, which we don't need. I'm going to use my control key to select all three of these files, and now I'm going to click on the delete key on my keyboard. Do I want to delete these items? Okay, and now I have deleted these temporary data files. Typically this isn't really necessary in SAS. You can have quite a few temporary data files. The only reason you'd want to get rid of them is if they were very large or they started interfering with the resources your computer needed to run the programs that you were submitting. Then deleting some of these would be a good idea. So this concludes Unit 1, and we'll take a little break and we'll come back for Unit 2.